This is the Alt Thinking Podcast by Ninepoint Partners, today featuring the DeFi Decoded series in partnership with Prophecy DeFi. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing. Hi, everybody, and welcome to DeFi Decoded. This is a new podcast series being presented by Ninepoint Partners LP and Prophecy DeFi. The goal of this podcast is to provide clear and straightforward insights, news, and analysis on the burgeoning and exciting world of decentralized finance. The podcast is going to run weekly. It will be initially a discussion between me and Andrew Young here, who is my co-host, where we'll be talking about some of the big themes and ideas, but we're hoping eventually to include some expert guests, business builders, and other leaders in the industry. DeFi is a very exciting thing. Obviously, this is a bleeding edge of blockchain and crypto assets, an area that has grown from being very small only a year or two ago to having a total value of locked assets of over $50 billion and attracting some of the best talent and some of the most knowledgeable investors to the space. But there's also a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding about just exactly what it is. We're very fortunate on this podcast to have Andrew as a co-host. Before I introduce or ask him to introduce himself, just a quick intro on me. I am the co-author of Blockchain Revolution, which has been translated into 16 languages and has sold around 500,000 copies worldwide. I have done lots of things in this business, acted as an advisor, an investor, as an author, and most recently, I head up the digital asset group at Ninepoint Partners LP. Ninepoint Partners is an $8 billion investment company based in Toronto, Canada. The goal of Ninepoint is to provide investors with alternative thinking, alternative ideas, and options for their portfolio. So it's within that context that crypto assets and even DeFi itself fits quite neatly. So as a firm, we're very committed to this area and we're very excited about what the future holds for this asset class. And as my co-host, I have Andrew Young. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. And that's a great description of the podcast and what we hope to achieve. My name is Andrew Young. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Layer 2, which is a subsidiary of Prophecy DeFi. I'm also the co-founder of SX Network, which is a decentralized prediction market protocol and smart contract blockchain. I've been operating in the decentralized finance space, or DeFi, since essentially its inception in 2018. I actually remember going to the very first DeFi meetup, which was held in the offices of Polychain back in 2018. And so I feel like I have a good firsthand perspective on the space. And I'm really excited to be here with Alex today to sort of bring DeFi knowledge to the everyday investor.
Thanks, Andrew. So before we jump into it, just to set the context, DeFi is the bleeding edge of the world of crypto assets, which is enabled by this thing called blockchain. The thesis that we've developed over the years and included in the book Blockchain Revolution was basically that blockchain was enabling a second era of the internet. The first era of the internet was the internet of information, basically a tool that allowed us to share, copy, duplicate, and move information around the world. And as a result, it had really profound impact on a lot of information-based industries like media, publishing, and so forth. But it didn't have as big an impact on the world of financial services as I think a lot of people were expecting. And that's because when you move something online, you're not sending, an original unique thing. You're sending a copy or a version, and you're retaining an original, which is actually very useful if it's information. It means you can duplicate the PowerPoint presentation or an email or something like that. But when it comes to assets like money or to shares in a business or to any other thing that requires scarcity, being able to duplicate it's obviously a bad idea. So what blockchain enables is digital scarcity, the ability to create digital assets that can represent lots of different kinds of things. They can be money, they can be shares in a company, they can be collectibles, art and other rare items, and they can be potentially any other kind of asset in the economy that requires scarcity. The way that we look at DeFi is this burgeoning world where individuals, institutions, and so forth can transact and do business and create value without the need for traditional financial intermediaries like banks, brokerages, credit card companies, insurance companies, and so forth. Instead of happening inside of institutions that act as silos, these happen across protocols using software. And that's the sort of operating principle of what we're going to be discussing today. So I'm not the DeFi expert. That's why we've got Andrew as a co-host here today. So Andrew, people have a hard time pinning down what exactly is DeFi. Why don't you give us your definition and tell us about some of the areas that you're focused at?
Totally. Well, I would think that you can consider yourself a bit of a DeFi expert. Don't sell yourself too short, Alex. Well, to me, the definition of DeFi is really DeFi uses public blockchains and smart contracts to create a financial industry in which traditional rent-seeking financial intermediaries are replaced by decentralized networks run on open source software. So that's obviously a mouthful, so I'll kind of dig into exactly what that means. But even before I dig into exactly, I think there's really three main benefits of DeFi, like why people should care about this. The first is that it creates these globally accessible financial markets. So essentially anyone with an internet connection can access DeFi markets. That's obviously totally different than what you get with traditional markets. The second is this idea of open source development platforms. So unlike a banking system where it's obviously very tough to build your own fintech or build your own bank, in the DeFi world, developers can build on DeFi without asking any permission. I like to think of it as Linux meets Royal Bank. Then finally, community ownership. So in these platforms, control and ownership of DeFi platforms is inherently democratized through this idea of token ownership. Now, so what is DeFi use cases actually are? To me right now, there's four main usages of DeFi. The biggest being trading. So essentially, DeFi facilitates the trading of blockchain-based tokens. And like you said, in the future, that actually may mean securities and traditional financial assets. But for now, it mostly just means crypto tokens. The second main thing that DeFi facilitates is lending. So it allows you to, these applications allow you to lend your tokens and earn a yield on them. And then finally, the third and fourth is predictions and derivatives. So essentially, this allows you to enter into complex financial transactions with variable payouts, such as like options and stuff like that. And really, to me, DeFi is essentially the financial system of this new crypto economy. And so as crypto continues to grow, DeFi just continues to grow as well.
So I started off at the outset talking about how there's a certain amount of value that is locked in some of these different protocols. It's, I think, as of today, around $54 or $55 billion. Obviously, that fluctuates with the value of the tokens and the amount that's bonded at any given point in time. But what exactly does that mean? I think this is a metric that gets thrown around a lot as an example of DeFi's growth. We've seen the TVL grow from $1 billion or 2 billion, maybe 12 or 14 months ago, to 50 today. So what exactly does that mean in practice, and how does that metric contribute to the usefulness of these kinds of protocols?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the main way to think of TVL is, like you said, total value locked. The comparison is really assets under management as like a comparison in the traditional markets. And so for a project like Compound, for example, which is a lending protocol, TVL is essentially all of the funds that are currently being lent through the Compound contracts. And then on the other side, all of the funds that are being borrowed from borrowers. And so essentially it's a measure of the total assets under management of these DeFi protocols. And as we'll dig into this as well, DeFi uses a lot of over collateralization. And so in a traditional sense, it's actually quite capital inefficient.
Yeah, why don't you explain what that means exactly, just for the audience?
Exactly. So with DeFi, all the counterparties in a decentralized financial application are essentially anonymous. And that means that they don't actually use the legal system to settle these contracts. The contracts are essentially use computer code to actually settle the contracts. So what I mean by that is in the lending use case, because you can't rely on the legal system to get repayment if someone defaults on their loan, the way these DeFi protocols work is the borrowers actually they actually take out an over collateralized loan. So they actually put up collateral in return to borrow funds.
Right.
And the reason why they would do that is essentially so that they can get leverage. So like I could put up $2 of Ether, which is a common cryptocurrency, and then in return, I can get a $1 loan, which I could then use to buy more Ether or use as just everyday liquidity.
Sort of like a margin account, right? If you've got $100,000 in the margin account, you can't borrow 100, but you can maybe borrow $40,000 or $50,000, right? So in that case, that's an example of an over collateralized loan in the traditional financial services industry. But here, what you're saying is that isn't through a brokerage or with a bank, where you've got the counterparty is the financial institution. In this case, this is between two parties who are connecting using this protocol Compound and have pledged their assets to the smart contract, right? So I think that's an interesting thread to pull on, because a lot of this is foundational. We're going to talk, I think, on this podcast about Compound and these lending protocols, Uniswap, which is a trading platform, Wi-Fi, which is in a number of things, but in some respects, a robo-advisor, right, that you can pledge assets to, all of these different kinds of protocols. But I think before we talk about how these things maybe are disrupting traditional financial institutions, we should go through a definition of what some of these core principles are. So we've talked about digital assets, basically as, things that are scarce. They cannot be duplicated because the transactions in them are recorded to these things called blockchains. You mentioned this other term, smart contracts. That's sort of foundational to this whole thing. So why don't you give a definition of the smart contract?
Yeah, smart contract is essentially a software program built direct and deployed directly on a public blockchain such as Ethereum. And there's others as well, like Polygon and Polkadot. And essentially, it facilitates a financial transaction based on the logic encoded into it. And what's interesting about it is that as validators on, for example, the Ethereum network validate transactions, they also facilitate the transactions that are happening in these smart contracts.
Those validators, they're also known as miners, right?
Miners, exactly.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
Miners. I think that's a term people are pretty familiar with now in the blockchain space. They're the nodes, the participants on the network that help to secure the transactions, these contracts, and then keep that record, that blockchain, so that everyone can sort of trust these systems.
Yeah, exactly. And just to give an example, so the reason why smart contracts are so interesting is that for something like the Bitcoin blockchain, it's very limited in what you can do because of the core scripting language. And so with Bitcoin, you can only send and receive Bitcoins. I guess the innovation and the innovation of Ethereum, which led to essentially decentralized finance, was this idea of complex transactions, which were facilitated through smart contracts. And the way I sort of try to describe them to traditional financial people is that they are kind of like an if statement. So if you use Excel, for example, so they allowed you to do transactions where if something happens, then the transaction happens. So I guess the way I think about it is it's a conditional transaction versus just a kind of linear, straight send and receive transaction.
Right. Well, there's plenty of examples of those if-then transactions in traditional financial markets as well. I mean, you could have a fill or kill order set at a specific price, and that's it's basically like a little contract, right? It's a bunch of conditions that, if met, will create a transaction which will cross two assets, cash for stocks, for example. And so the only difference here is that this is all happening in an automated, self-executing piece of software versus involving a million different little financial institutions with all these different trusted roles within the system, essentially. So that's a great sort of eye-opening thing. So if you imagine this idea of smart contracts being applied to simple transactions, you can also imagine them being applied to more complex transactions as well. And I think we're going to get into a lot of that over the next few weeks and months as we explore this, exciting new world of DeFi. But I think we've given our audience enough to think about for the week. We'll be back next week to talk about some of these use cases in a little bit more detail. What is a decentralized exchange? How do these lending protocols work? What are the benefits? What are the limitations? What are the challenges? How do existing financial institutions feel about all of this? There's lots to unpack, and we're going to do it. We welcome your feedback, of course, as we launch this podcast. The podcast will be available on Apple, on Spotify, and wherever podcasts are listened to. We're also going to post this video. There is a video on YouTube as well, on both the Ninepoint Partners as well as the Prophecy DeFi YouTube channel. So please stay tuned for that. That concludes our first week. Not bad, I think, for first kick of the can, Andrew. So thanks, and we'll chat again soon.
Looking forward to it, guys.
Great. Take care, everyone.
You've been listening to the Alt Thinking Podcast by Ninepoint Partners. For more alternative investing ideas, insights, and strategies, subscribe by visiting ninepoint.com. The opinions, estimates, and projections contained within this recording are solely those of Ninepoint Partners and are subject to change without notice. Ninepoint makes every effort to ensure that the information has been derived from sources believed to be reliable and accurate. However, Ninepoint assumes no responsibility for any losses or damages, whether direct or indirect, which arise out of the use of this information. These views are not to be considered investment advice, nor should they be considered a recommendation to buy or sell. Investment funds are not guaranteed. Their values change frequently and past performance may not be repeated. Important information about the Ninepoint Partners funds, including investment objectives and strategies, purchase options, and applicable management fees and other charges and expenses, is contained in their respective prospectus or offering memorandum. Please read these documents carefully before investing. We strongly recommend that you consult your investment advisor for a comprehensive review of your personal financial situation before undertaking any investment strategy. For more information, visit ninepoint.com/legal.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not resident in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.